It's the 15th of February,
1991.
1991, imagine. Go ahead. Shoot.
Florence Michelle, being asked some interesting questions, I hope.
This is your life.
This is your life, Florence Michelle. Well, one of the first things, I've never really talked to you about this, and I'm curious, is tell me sort of where you were in your life, what you were doing when you thought about going to law school, and how did it all come about, actually?
Well, this may be one of the first times. In fact, I don't even know if I told Skolnikov the real truth about how I came to go to law school. This might be the first time on record that I admitted the truth of it. The story I tell everybody is that when I was a child, my father intended for me to be a lawyer. He was going to have me go to Harvard at a time when it was all-male school. It was not yet coeducational. I was to practice on Park Avenue, and I had to give my solemn word of honor. I had to swear on my soul that 2 days a week or 2 afternoons a week, I don't remember, I would go down to the east side and practice for nothing. I had to promise him absolutely on my soul. And the fact is that when I got out of high school, I started to go to school at night at CCNY. And during the day, it was not yet coeducational in those days, but it was a very good school. And I took a pre-law course, and I couldn't keep up I lived in Mineola. I worked in Hempstead. I had to come back to Mineola because nobody ate dinner out or bought a sandwich. Who had money for things like that?
Mineola's on Long Island?
It's on Long Island, about 25 miles east of, it's the county seat for Nassau County. Mm-hmm. And so I had to come home to eat, then rush for the train, and in order to save money, I didn't go to Penn Station. I went to the Brooklyn station and then took the subway up to 125th Street and then walked across town to 137th Street. So just taking 2 classes a night, I began to have a lot of absences. So I never went very far with that. And I never thought again about it ever. I thought a lot about going to college and missed it all my life, but I never thought again about going to law school. But I was at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara in the whole 60s decade into the first year of the 70s. And beginning in 64, I think, I went with the sit-down demonstrations.
In 63, 64.
Okay. For those years, we had the Center devoted every summer to a study of the First Amendment and to law generally, but especially the First Amendment. The First Amendment and the Negro, because there were Negroes in those days.
As opposed to blacks.
Right. And we had jurisprudential scholars from all over the world. The man who wrote the Constitution for Indonesia, who later became Governor General of New Zealand, the leading jurisprudential scholar from Belgium, William Douglas, of course, always, Warren. I mean, practically half the members of the Supreme Court. Harry Calvin Jr. from the University of Chicago, who later became a very good friend and has written a book wrote largely on the First Amendment, has some very interesting First Amendment cases. It was sheer music. I mean, Hutchins, who was already by then cynical and jaded, sat at that table like a man who has finally been reunited with his first love, and it's good. It's still good. And everybody took on such excitement from his excitement. And I heard cases analyzed as I never heard them analyzed when I went to law school later. And
were they debates, Florence?
No, you take a decision. You take a decision of the Supreme Court and you begin to pick it to pieces. How far had they gone? Why had they not gone a little farther? Why were they? And don't forget, this was not just jurisprudential scholars. There were journalists there. There were psychologists there. There were scientists. Linus Pauling, Sir Robert Watson Watt, who invented radar. I mean, there were lots of disciplines there.
At a round table?
Well, the table was rectangular because we couldn't get it really round, but we had a big hole in the middle so that... But the questions that came about the decisions that were made were questions that came from people who were not trained in the law. I remember Howard Hoffman saying, what is the court so afraid of? Why does it, tiptoe so carefully around an issue that anybody with any sense of justice would know how to handle? But the lawyers there understood that the court has to pay a great deal of attention to all the segments of the society. You can't, with a single decision, affect such disequilibrium, as indeed in the end they did. We would get a lot of scuttlebutt too behind the scenes talk. Douglas, for example, one time saying, we pleaded with Thurgood, bring us a case we could act on, before the Brown decision, which he finally brought. But justices were doing things like that, and you got a lot of the backstage talks about it. And I don't think it was just because Hutchins was on fire. Everybody was on fire, but it was also another love of mine. Okay. And I was really on fire, and they were very hard tapes for me to edit.
Where were you in the next room with taping all of this?
At the beginning, I think I was still in the boardroom, sitting in the middle of the room because I had two, God, I can't think of the word I want. The input things like this too, but they were not tape machines. Right. The taping went on in the next room, and then at some point, let's see. Watts burned down in '63, I think, right? 63, 64. Yes. Okay, I was still in the room. At some point after the legal conferences, they built me yes, it was after the legal conferences, the 3 summers in a row in the First Amendment. They built me a recording studio, which was soundproof. And then I could sit behind the glass, and I got bored with that after a while, so I hired an engineer so I could sit in the room because it was much more interesting that way. But we had all the equipment for recording, for duplicating tapes. I had an oscilloscope. I didn't know what the hell it meant, except when it did a lot of crazy designs, I would quickly listen in and, to see what, just as you might with the earphones right now, you might listen in to see what does it sound like, really, and what kind of quality are you getting. But once these, we dealt with when you restructure a voting
gerrymandering,
but also what's the thing that the
redistricting?
Yes, but there's still another word for it with a word proportion. I can't think of the word. We did a lot of programs like that. We did a lot of programs about distribution of wealth, whether it was possible constitutionally in the capitalist system. There was a lot of auxiliary stuff that came as well. But the discussions of the Supreme Court's decisions were just absolutely wonderful. For example, New York Times versus Sullivan, just to give you an example of it, because, up until New York Times, you had to be absolutely factually correct in every single instance in order to be able to prevail in a libel suit. The New York Times said that, first of all, it was an advertisement, but still, they got him on that. They said that they sang, I may have the things mixed up, God Bless America, where actually they sang My Country 'Tis of Thee. They said there were 40,000 people, and actually there were 20,000 people. They said that so-and-so said such and such, and actually that was the near meaning of it, and it wasn't a distortion of actual meaning, but the words were not precise. So here the court had to deal with something which really could hold the New York Times guilty of libel. It met all the definitions of the prior cases. So that's where the notion of actual malice got introduced. Because that ad that the New York Times ran, which Sullivan sued about, was reproduced in 40 newspapers. If they had succeeded in getting $1 million, then 40 newspapers would have been sued for $1 million, and the $40 million would have bankrupted the New York Times. So the agenda that the Supreme Court had was that they couldn't wreck the leading newspaper in the country. They had to find a way around that to redefine the things. Now, Alexander Meiklejohn came in. This is another whole story about Meiklejohn, who taught history at Amherst through New York, through Supreme Court cases, because we learned through the law. That's why he taught. That's why he taught the history of this country, was through law cases. And Meiklejohn said this is an occasion for dancing in the streets. Calvin was almost sputtering with excitement, and there sat Hutchins, dour and cynical, saying it was a muddy decision, ill-written, cloudy. Nobody really knows what actual malice means. All they did was lay the groundwork for the next decision, which they would have some difficulty dealing with. Absolutely true.
I was just going to say that.
Absolutely true. So you see that. You see the excitement that went on.
So it must have been wonderful.
It was incredible, and just by the way, because I just like the story to be on tape anyway, it reminds me that the first thing that Harry Calvin did in that first summer that he came. Well, there are two stories. One's the Garner story, so remind me if I forget. The first thing that he did was he had just come out of Chicago, and there was a demonstration by the students. They were sitting in the office of the president of the University of Chicago. This was a very good man, as Harry said. This was a man whose heart was in the right place, whose racial attitudes were absolutely impeccable. And he said it was a dreadful thing for them to do this to such a good man. Almost 3 months later, after discussing various cases with various disciplines around the table, he said, I want to reverse myself from a stand I took on the first day. This is the best illustration I know of the dialectic process which took place, and maybe the most dramatic because it was perceptible. Usually you don't really know when an idea takes hold of it. But here he said, I want to reverse myself and take a position 180 degrees diametrical. And I hope that you will, with your good sense, disabuse me of my new notion. But I now think that demonstrations are the poor man's printing press, and therefore are protected under the First Amendment. Well, what a howl! What a howl! And Zelman Cowen, who was the Governor General, or was going to become the Governor General of New Zealand, and was the Dean of the Law School at the University of Law at Melbourne, said, are you suggesting that effectiveness, that efficacy, he said, are you suggesting that efficacy is a criterion of the law? So, okay.
The Garner?
The Garner case. The first case that he introduced for discussion.
Who he?
Harry Calvin, because he headed up in the first summer that we had as a study of the First Amendment. It was the First Amendment and race was the orientation. And it was a kind of a loose agenda, a loose title. But the first case that he discussed was the Garner case, and I thought Hutchins would absolutely jump out of his skin. He was so irritated because Harry was in love with the case, and he discussed it on 3 separate days, and Hutchins wanted to press on. There were important decisions to be made. And it wasn't important to Hutchins because the Garner case could never happen again. It happened that in this little town in Mississippi, they did not have a trespassing law. There wasn't any trespassing law. And Harry felt that because there was not a trespassing law, it put into very sharp relief the whole race question. Because when these kids sat down at the counter, the black kids sat down at the counter to eat, there wasn't a trespassing law for
that they were violating.
Keeping them out. They weren't violating a trespassing law. Therefore, the court had to deal with the issue without being able to reach it on low ground. And he was fascinated by it, and so was I. When I went to law school years later, I never saw the word Garner versus Louisiana except once in a constitutional law book when it was footnoted for something that wasn't the least bit interesting. I looked up, it wasn't in the least bit interesting. I asked my constitutional law teacher if he'd never, heard about that case. No, he never had heard about that case. Nobody I ever met ever knew that case, and I'm sure I did 3 broadcasts on it, and I'm sure nobody ever remembered them. But Harry Calvin died 1 month before the deadline for questions to be submitted to the bar to be included in the bar exam. He died a month before the deadline for submitting your questions, a constitutional law teacher, professor would be asked to write the con law question. A contracts professor would be asked to do that, the torts professor. And they came from different parts of the country. And I think the deadline for the bar, which I took in February because I was out 6 months with my back operation, the deadline was the end of November. And Harry died, I think, the last week of October, the first week of November. I'm convinced that the shade of my husband met the shade of Calvin and said, look, you love her too, don't you? Look how agonized that poor woman is. Do something, help her. And I think Harry got into the head of the guy who wrote the constitutional law question because the lazy bastard didn't even bother to change a single fact in Garner versus Lewis. Except he did add, he added one little strand for Jehovah's Witnesses.
That's wonderful.
I saw that question. I was recovering from back surgery. I took the exam standing up with a hot pad tied, an electric hot pad tied around my waist. I was taking codeine in quarter tablets so I wouldn't get a little too drunk. And I had a schedule for how long it would last. So 10 minutes before it would go down, I would take another quarter tablet. And I had 2 typewriters in case one broke down, as indeed happened. My kids built me a kind of a pulpit so I could stand up through the whole thing taking the exam. Ronnie, I typed over 14 pages in 55 minutes about the Garner case. I'll never know whether I got very good marks on all the rest of the subjects because I think they had
That's
points.
such a good story.
And I had to have had, instead of 100 points, I must have gotten 1,500 points. I mean, I had to have put things down that the guy never even thought of. Because did he have the benefit not only of 3 days of discussion at the center, but it took me 3 months to edit the damn thing because Harry talked so fast that the words spit out. And he didn't finish sentences. He didn't finish words because he knew where he was going, so he'd stop there and leap into the next paragraph.
That's wonderful.
And I was having to write continuity to make those bridges, so I knew that case. Okay.
That's hysterical.
It is. It's a wonderful story. I'm convinced that there's a hereafter. Michelle and Harry Calvin got together on that. Because who in the world would choose a case that was so atypical?
That's right.
So atypical. You know, for a con law test, you want something that people can apply, reasoning that they've been introduced to.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, but how did I get to go to law school?
What year did you take the exam?
75. And it was the lowest, I think to this date, it's the lowest pass rate of any bar exam yet. 42% or 41% or something like that. Anyway, so that's the mid-60s, right? And somewhere, now this is the truth that has never been told to anybody about why I went to law school. I had a very good job.
As the
At the center.
Were you? The title was the editor?
No, I was called director of the audio tape department. I had an engineer working for me. I had a full-time secretary. I got to go on all the international conferences, I went to Geneva for the one on peace, and to New York on the one on peace, and to Malta for the one on the law of the seas. And it was a well-paying job, and it was a job with a lot of interest, a lot of interesting people.
The boys were grown by that point?
Boys were both at school.
College.
So the first thing that happened is that I got my note, which was the last note that I took, the last money that I borrowed to send a child off to school, arrived paid. I had paid it in full. So suddenly, for the first time in my life, I didn't have to allocate my money to take care of somebody else. The whole salary was mine. And I had managed not too badly with boys in school. But all of a sudden, all that money was mine. I think in the first place that must have sent me into a panic right away. I mean,
good fortune.
Right. I wasn't used to that. Alternatives presented themselves. Decisions had to be made. But I also was fed up with the job. I had thought that I could conquer my shyness and try to participate in the discussions. And that would both test me and would stretch me. And you have to remember that I'm the first woman who ever walked into that boardroom, and I met a lot of anxiety about having a woman in the boardroom. By the time I had left, there was Elizabeth Momborghese and Eula Laux was there, and a woman who was on the magazine. There were several other people there.
As visiting scholars or as workers?
As people who were on staff on a regular basis. The woman who worked in the magazine almost never opened her mouth. She could have had she wanted to, but she almost never did. But I began to notice something I had noticed other times, like the times that I was in the party, and I never dared open my mouth because it seemed to me that if I'm thinking about it, so obvious that it's either not true or it's too obvious, and it's it's a given. And who would mention something that was a given? And then hours later or days later, I would hear somebody make that point, and I had made it beforehand. Mm-hmm. I had very good conversations with people, one-to-one, but I never opened my mouth. And I realized that I have got to do that. Otherwise, it wasn't enough for me just to be listening to tape, running it. And I was maniacal about getting the tape accurate. I would never do what I hear being done now, where you hear somebody with half a word and it's cut off. Mm-hmm. I would cut it so you wouldn't hear a breath, so that the sentence seemed to go on, even though I might have taken it off 25 minutes in between. Mm-hmm. I always edited in a way that the transition was easy, and I took a lot of pains with things, but it got boring after a while. I had listened to the discussion. I had understood the discussion. Now I wanted to go on the next thing. I didn't want to regurgitate it for 3 times, going over and over the same material. And it's not like editing it. When you edit it on paper, you look at it one time or even twice, and you cross out things and you change things and you make them more graceful. But on tape, you've got to listen to it to see whether the cuts you made, does it add up? You listen to that tape 2 or 3 times if you're as compulsive as I was. So it was getting to be less and less gratifying. And I had made up my mind that I would start participating in a modest little way at the table, because I sat at the table. And I had an engineer in the control booth. I didn't even have to sit there when he was sick. I would go back there and I would mix. And I got to be a good engineer. I could mix 20 pots quickly. And that's 20 mics going around. You know exactly when to open up the mic and how to get a balance on 2 sides of the room. Well, I practiced. I would sit at the table and I'd practice saying something, get my eyes crossing and getting anxious and, tense. And finally, one day, I put my hand up, as everybody did. They were polite. They didn't interrupt each other. Well, they did sometimes, but usually I put my hand up and Hutchins leaned over and said, "What is it, dear?" Oh. I said nothing. And that just killed any sense that I had of being taken seriously if I said something. And I wanted out. And I really wanted also not to work anymore. I thought all my life I've been waiting for a chance to visit with good friends and read good books and just take long walks. And I want a way of getting out of here that will not expose me to a lot of ridicule. And this is the first time I'm ever telling this to somebody, or a lot of criticism. So I announced one day that I was going to go to law school.
Just like that?
Yeah. And I began to... First of all, I had to find out what was required, since I knew I didn't have a college degree. And so first I took I studied for the LSAT. That's right, isn't it LSAT?
This would be what now, 69 or 70?
I entered law school in 1971. So I took my LSAT in 70. So it was about 69 that I announced that I was going to go to law school, and I began to save my money. I mean, here was all that money. Well, the whole paycheck was mine, right? So I was putting that away. And I was studying for the LSAT. The grammar and the other questions weren't difficult, but reviewing the arithmetic of the
must have been difficult.
Very difficult. And I got a very bad exam because we had graphs on 3 levels. And that was I don't think I did well on that. But I didn't do badly. I've forgotten what my score was, but it was not too low to have me not be considered. Then began the business of making application, because I had no law degree. So that had to be
no college degree.
I had no college degree, thanks. And even though I had been going to school almost all the time, but I'd just taken courses, at UCLA or wherever. I would just take a course in literature or something that interested me. So then I began collecting letters, and I still have them, as a matter of fact. I just had to go over one that Edgardo wrote. I looked to see what he had said about me. Harry Calvin, Edgardo Contini, Robert Hutchins.
Do you have them?
Yeah, I have them still. And I got some nasty replies from, for example, the dean of the law school at USC said she saw no reason why she should make room for someone who, by the time I graduated, would be already close to 70 or in her 60s. And what makes you think you justify taking the seat of a 21-year-old? I wrote back a very nice letter I'd like to show you one time when I said that 21-year-old might be someone who's going to be practicing in Wall Street and thinks it will be advantageous to have a law degree, or he may be somebody who will not be interested in the kind of clients that I'll be willing to accept. And
this was a woman that wrote that?
Yeah, it was a woman who wrote that. And I often wanted to write to her again when I was at the board, or now working for the San Francisco Lawyers Committee for Urban Affairs, doing pro bono work. I often think I'd like to sit down and say, just send her a Xerox of that letter and my reply and say, I thought you might like to know that. But I think she's dead without me. I think she died not long ago. Anyway, I had people who were absolutely crazy to have me, and they all were Jesuits. Here at USF, and Father, who's that marvelous man at Notre Dame?
I wouldn't know the name.
Not Father Harbrake, he was at Georgetown. Oh, this wonderful man who helped Harris Warford invent the Peace Corps for the Kennedys. He begged me to come to Notre Dame and the Catholic University in Washington. It was interesting. All the Catholic universities, they wanted me because I was old, and I would be old when I graduated. They wanted me because I didn't have a high school diploma. And one of the things I found out...
A college degree?
I didn't have a college degree. I misspeak myself. Grace Oliveras, who was a worker in New Mexico and later became very active nationally. In fact, she headed up some federal agency, went straight to law school at the University of Notre Dame with just a high school diploma. And she was the one who told me that
it could be done.
It could be done. And so that's how I went, because I wanted to get out of what I was doing. And I don't even know that I had a very clear idea that I would really ever practice.
So then...
I just wanted out. And I didn't know any other way of getting... It's like somebody wanted out of a marriage, and you had to think of some... You either had to get a tuberculosis or some terrible disease, or you had to go to India, which is the only place they could cure you, or whatever it was. Because it was so shocking to my friends that I would think of leaving the center. And Lucy, to this day, doesn't forgive me.
Is that so?
The only time in my life that I asked her for financial help, I don't mean that she hasn't been generous and she hasn't given me some very generous gifts, unsought, but the only time that I asked her for financial help was when I was going to law school. And I discovered that when we got this house, and I thought that I would live rent-free, and the money had been, kind of saved and budgeted for a certain amount of money for repairs, $10,000, and we ran into $60,000 worth of repairs. I ate up my college money that way.
Sure.
And I asked Lucy for money, and she refused it. She refused it because she said, I disapprove of you leaving the center. You had the opportunity of a lifetime. Nobody will ever have a job like that again. And for you to just give it up like that, I'm not going to be party to it. And
has she regretted it in the years since?
She still thinks that I made a great mistake. That I never exploited my position there. I talked to you about that the other day, that in contrast to our friend, I didn't want to be known by the identification of the center because I felt then I wouldn't be seen.
That's right. You'd be lost in it. How did, for instance, Phyllis, how did she feel about it?
Phyllis loved the idea because Phyllis, I think we're getting, Phyllis came, Phyllis was still married to Marv in those days, and Phyllis came up to the center very often. It was just an hour and a half drive, a little bit less maybe. And she came frequently. I got permission very quickly for her to sit against the wall and listen. She loved attending all those sessions, and she loves the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So she was all for it. I think it's getting time for us to turn that tape.
Okay.
Maybe not quite. It's still...
Looks like there's some.
Yeah, I think there is. It probably will stop itself, and
all right.
And we'll hear it.
We'll hear it quick.
Yeah, I think so. And if we don't, we'll know very, very soon.
What made you pick USF as opposed to Notre Dame or Catholic University? Or?
Well, everybody wanted me to go to Loyola, which was in Los Angeles. My mother was in Los Angeles. One of my sisters was in Los Angeles. All my friends were in Los Angeles. And I thought that I don't have the discipline. I think it should be, yeah, it's recording
it's okay.
now. It's
Good.
brown tape. I thought that I wouldn't have the discipline to turn down invitations to parties or to lunch. But more important than that, Hutchins said when I told them I was leaving, what will we do without our curbside psychiatrist? Well, I was everybody's therapist. And it got to a place where at one point I got a second telephone put into my bedroom and gave only very few people that number. Because the day could go with people telephoning me. And,
about their private lives.
Right. And people, were in trouble, and I was pretty good at things like that usually. In fact, my first idea was not to go to law school, but to become a therapist. And I couldn't find a single university which would give me something that they give you today. But they weren't prepared at that point to give you credit for your life's experience as if you had gotten a college degree. Mm-hmm. And so I would have had to do the whole 4 years, or a little bit less than 4 years because I had some CCNY credits, but almost 4 years of undergraduate work, plus the graduate work. And I thought that was too hard. And today you can be a lay therapist without even going to a university. And in many places they give you your life's life experience credit. But in those days, no really good school of medicine would accept me. So that left the law, But the other strands that I told you were true. I was excited by those 3 years of the law school. I really was. My first wish, though, was to be a therapist because I thought I had a gift for that. And the reason I didn't go to L.A. was because of having a gift for that kind of therapy or counseling, I didn't think I would be free enough to be able to attend.
Free of your world that you'd been
That's
part
right.
of.
Yeah, free of calls on me.
Yeah.
Whereas in a new city, where my son, I had a son here.
David was here?
Yeah, David was here. My sister Lee was here, but in those years I wasn't seeing very much of her, as you know. And the irony of it was that within 6 months my mother followed me up here. Not only that, but she came a week before finals.
Oh,
so that I had to settle her. I remember Phyllis flew up from Los Angeles and said, "I'll help you with it."
Classic. It is, really.
She said, "I want to help you out, dear."
Thank you, my dear.
Yeah.
So you decided on USF?
USF because I had ever since the first time I saw San Francisco, which was 1937. In 1937, I came up on New Year's Eve. I got a gown out of the wardrobe at Warner Brothers because I was working there, and an evening coat, which half a dozen women at the St. Francis, I think, it was either St. Francis.
Mark Hopkins, maybe?
It wasn't Mark Hopkins. It was the other one that's across the street from the Huntington, across the street from
The Fairmont?
Fairmont. It was either at the St. Francis or Fairmont or both because we went around, drinking and dancing. Half a dozen women came up and said, "Where did you get the coat?" I said, "Warner Brothers wardrobe." But a woman who's the head of the wardrobe there, Gwen, would let me have anything I wanted.
Oh, God,
and
what
I was
wonderful.
thin in those days,
Oh, wonderful.
So ever since I saw San Francisco, I had vowed I would come and I would live here eventually. So it wasn't hard for me to choose the city where I would like to remain afterwards. I'd always wanted to live in San Francisco. I think in the beginning I envisioned that it would be, living would be the experience at the time that I was in school, but it wasn't very long before I knew I would stay.
So then you moved up and moved in here right then, or the house was not, you couldn't live there?
David put the down payment on the house, actually, and we owned it together.
I think you said that.
Yeah, and I bought him out after he and Linda wanted to buy a house so he could have the down payment.
So you moved up that fall, the fall of what, 71?
The house wasn't ready, so I sublet a house on Guerrero in 23rd from Pink Fairy's daughter. She was going to France for a month, and she had some marijuana plants to be taken care of. I didn't know they were marijuana, so I have a wonderful story to tell you about that sometimes too.
So you had that whole house for the first of it?
The first month, yeah. And then by that time, David was finished with this. David and Tony together worked on it in the summer. Then they were finished with this house, and David then moved into the cottages and worked much more leisurely and brought those up to condition for rental.
What do you recall now about those first days in law school? What did you think of it?
Well, I remember David got up at 3 in the morning, I think, to try to get me a parking parking permit. And he was online. I think the office opened at 8, and he was the one before him got the last parking permit. And so I would park my car miles away and carry these huge books. And my sister Lee called me one day and said, "Did you know that I had a bad back already then, and I used to wear a heavy bag of sand around like the Japanese wear this kind of cushiony thing in the rear. I used to wear a bag like that made of sand around my back because one doctor hypothesized that by pushing the pelvis in, it would take the strain off my back. It didn't, but people who know me at law school always remember me with a sandbag. And my sister called me one time and said, "Do you know that people who have medical problems or are of a certain age are automatically given parking permits?" So I found out what department to go to, which was across the street. And as I walked in, this woman looked up and said, "I know a retread when I see one." And she gave me a parking permit immediately. So I remember the exhaustion. And I remember how self-conscious not only were the students with me, but teachers. And to the end of my time at school, there were teachers who never looked in my direction.
Probably because you were smarter than they were.
No, I think they probably had a bad mother or a bad mother-in-law. I always figured, and I said this since to some of the young men I've met since, some of my former colleagues, I always knew when a young man had a good relationship with his mother because they were very nice to me. They were extremely nice to me, and it turned out to be true. And the girls in the beginning sort of, can I say girls instead of young women? Yeah.
It's allowed.
My age, it's allowed. As someone at the office of the board once said to me, "Well, because of your age, I will take offense when you say girls." But the young women there, some of them resented me in the beginning because these kids were the age of my sons. And I never had any boys in my family. No uncles, no men around except my father. And so I was never comfortable around boys. I didn't know anything about boys. But I was very comfortable with kids who were my kids at the ages of my sons. And as my sons got older, I was more comfortable. This man that I talked to about, who lives in Petaluma,
yes,
George, I told him how terrified I was of him. When I first met him, he was 13. But David was only 7. And I didn't know anything about 13-year-olds, and I said to him, "I was scared shitless of you." He said, "You were so right." But I wasn't comfortable. I was comfortable with kids who were like my kids, or I had been there. So I get into school and I feel very comfortable.
With the young men.
With the young men, because they were all like my sons. And some of the young women told me afterwards that they were jealous. Not that I was so comfortable, because they were out waiting to make somebody, to get to meet somebody. And they were not always comfortable because they were watchful. But I was, so I remember that I had very good young sons. The other thing I remember about law school was having to unlearn so much that was no longer true. Things that I had learned when I was very young, in New York, for example, rules about a hotel. Could a hotel, if you rented a room you reserved a room for 3 nights and you decided to stay on for another week, and they said they didn't have any rooms, did they have the right to find you another place and tell you that they had no place? Or once having taken possession, could they no longer evict you? Well, when I was growing up, they couldn't. There was a rule about that. And so I was pretty adamant about knowing the answer to that one, raising my hand. And I was wrong, because things like that had happened enough so that they began to make complicated rules about whether you paid for your own linen or whether they paid for the linen. Was it furnished? Was it unfurnished? And they had all kinds of ways that would protect the hotel. So there were, that's one example that comes to mind, but there were others. Things that I had learned as a child, as a young woman growing up in my late teens and early 20s, that happened not to be the law anymore. So I was having to unlearn things as well.
I would bet also it was hard for you to fit your spirit into those narrow little categories. You know what I mean?
Yes, the first, I was shocked on the first exams that I took, which means at the end of the first semester.
Right.
I came out at kind of a general C, and in my class ranking, I was about the middle, or maybe a little 1 or 2 below the middle.
First time in your life, I bet.
Yeah, and I had a teacher in criminal law who liked me a lot, and who invited me out a lot, and to his home with a then fiance, later wife, and that reminds me. David did a terrible thing. He had an affair with this man's fiance. Terrible. I just remembered it. Dear God.
Did the fellow find out about that?
Did he punish me in school? Did he whip me with such sarcasm and such nastiness, taking it out on me? Really, I absolutely forgotten until this minute.
You remind David of it.
Mm-hmm.
Remind him.
But he liked me a lot. In fact, when I hit my 60th birthday, he brought bottles of wine into class and insisted on canceling the class and having a party. He brought a big birthday cake, and
oh, wonderful,
for the youngest student we've got here, and it was wonderful. So I went to him. I said,
when you got to grades,
when I got my grade, and said, what did I do wrong? And he said, I'm very disappointed in you. He said, I thought you would have turned out to be coming from the center, I thought you would turn out to be my prize student.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, he showed me. It never occurred to me. He said about narrow things. Some things, why did I have to say, if I've given a question, why did I have to go define all the things that the violation was and was not, and give all the parts, I was going to say the parts of speech, the factors that go up, that make up each violation. I mean, was there intent? I dealt with the problem. I came out with the right answers, but I missed all the little steps. I didn't know that I had to regurgitate everything. So then I found out, and I wound up as the student who made the most progress from the first exam to the last exam.
Is that so?
I got $6,000 Bancroft Whitney prize.
Oh my!
Yeah, $6,000 in stuff.
This is at the end of the
at graduation.
Year.
Yeah.
Oh my!
But I didn't know that you had to do that. I didn't know that you'd.
They must demonstrate you understand how to follow orders of logic, I suppose.
Well, step by step by step. I mean, if I can multiply 12 by 12 and say quickly it's 144, I'm not going to say 2 times 2 is 4 and 2 times 1 is 2, then on the next line use 2, 1 times 2 is 2, and then add it. If I know 12 times 12 is 144, I would go right back to that. And that's it's not a very good example, but you know what I mean, I think.
When did you come to know the people that you were closest to? Mrs. O'Donnell, is that her name? And Evelyn?
She was in a class with me in that same criminal law class.
First year,
and she got up and she gave a very good answer, and the same teacher gave her back a snotty remark, and she was fast, quick, witty, not unpleasant and not rude, but she was very quick. And I looked at her and I thought, she'd make a nice girlfriend for David, you know?
Oh my.
And so I asked her afterwards if she'd tell me her name, and I said, I'd love you to come over and meet my son. And she said, well, I'd love to meet your son. And she said, can I bring my husband?
You said, okay.
So I said, I had fantasies that I would love you to get together with my son. But can you not be complimented by that? I mean, would any person not feel pleased by that? Then it turned out that they had looked at this house to buy before they bought the house, which was on Diamond and 1 block up toward 22nd Street.
Oh my.
And they bought a much superior house to what
yours was initially.
This was here. But they also wanted income property because Jim was finishing up at UC as an ophthalmologist. He had not yet taken his boards. And so he was in residency or internship, I don't remember which, and she was going to law school. She had been a teacher. And she made me a most marvelous daughter. She found out very quickly that I'm very disorganized, that I'm bright, but all over the place, that I do everything simultaneously. So we had all our classes, took all the same classes. So she wrote out an outline for me. On Monday you study this, and on Tuesday you study this, and on Wednesday afternoon we play, and on Thursday you do the following things, and every other Sunday we play. And they took me around the city to show me the different parts of the city, and they took me out to the country, and they included me in lots of things. They really they adopted me as a mother. And see, I had lots of people coming from the center who came, and I would ask them for dinner. And I would try to say to Margaret how grateful I was. I'd never forget how well she looked after me. And she'd say, Florence, you don't realize I could have sold my place at your dinner table when my tiger was here. Don't you know what you're doing for me?
That's pretty funny.
Huh?
That's wonderful.
Yeah, but she was very, very good to me. And, one of the Valentine's cards here, she never fails to send me a Valentine's card or a Christmas card. Once a year she takes me out to dinner or lunch. And
Were you involved with any particular fellow at that point in your life?
yeah, I was still seeing the man that I had begun to see at the center. I told you I'd seen somebody for 13 years. And I continued to see him until that fateful day, I guess, when I ate the bouillabaisse into the fish heads apart. He sat there, did it like this with his hand in front of his face, so he would have to watch me. No, it was a little more complicated than that. I saw him for a couple of years after I graduated from law school.
He was still down in Los Angeles?
No, he never lived in Los Angeles.
I see.
He lived in the Midwest.
I see.
He'd fly out to see me, and he was a board member at the center. So there were lots of, I don't think anybody in Santa Barbara ever knew about us. I was very private and very discreet. Or maybe, to be a little bit more honest, I never wanted anybody to know about any affairs I was having, because when it would be over, and I knew it would always be over at some point, I didn't want the humiliation of it.
Or other people dissecting what you did and didn't do.
Yeah. And, this was an academic community, and it lived on gossip. I mean, it's like any other academic setting. Yeah, the first time I met Stringfellow Barr, I had read, years earlier, I had read purely academic. And you have to realize I'm scarred by not having gone to college. And
still, do you think?
Even Hutchins used to say to me, what do you now lack? You've had the equivalent of 3 college educations here. What is it you lack? And I say, once I said to him, philosophy. He said, maybe you can't tell me the philosophy of John Hume. Maybe you can't tell me the philosophy of, Wittgenstein. And he went down the thing. He said, but you know it when you deal with it. Your continuity shows that you understand it. He said, you don't recognize that that's what you're giving back. That you don't recognize that that's where it comes from. But you have studied it and you know it. To a degree, I suppose. But I always suffered from that. So that...
Suffered in your sense of your own self-esteem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know, and it was a lack, so that when I read Purely Academic, which was Winky's account of a year at a school that it was thinly disguised as the experience, I think, that when he was teaching at University of Virginia. This is a funny novel. It was said to be hilarious. I wept through the whole thing. And when he came to join the center, I went up to him and introduced myself, and I said, I may be the only reader you have who went through Purely Academic. And he said, well, I'm sure you travel a lot more lightly now. But I was surprised to find out what gossips there were.
About each other's
private
business.
lives. Yeah, nothing. Nothing was kept from anybody else. People just gossiped all the time. And I understand that's the way it is in an academic community.
I guess
among the faculty.
It's probably so, don't you think, for any small sort of ingrown group that
That's right.
exists together over time,
Yeah.
a bunch of adults, I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
When you look back on it, how do you think that having gone to law school changed you, if it did, in terms of how you think about either the world or yourself?
Well, law school made me think more precisely in many ways.
Logically, you mean?
I've always had, I'm told, because for someone who has a lot of insight, there's an awful lot about myself that I'm not aware of. I'm told that I have a very good abstract mind, that I think very skillfully in abstract terms. But I think I have a muddy way of what is it David once said, that I think synthetically, which he means I make a synthesis.
All at once.
All at once, whereas other people take strand by strand and then put it into some kind of an order. Mine is like a scatter approach, and it's much less well organized that way. It's sloppier. It made me. Well, I don't know whether it was law school because it already started with the editing. I couldn't have a fuzzy antecedent. If you were editing, you have to make clear what the antecedent is of a pronoun. You just can't have a whole bunch of pronouns all over the place. So that already started a habit for me that I had not had of looking to make sure that the meaning was clear. But in being a lawyer, I don't ask questions as good as yours. I don't know anybody who asks questions. No, really, I think you ask the best questions of anybody I know. And I've learned a certain amount just by listening to you and watching you. But I got some of that, being a lawyer, that no statements are taken for granted. How do you know that? Mm-hmm. And I tend to view, I think this is going to be lifelong lasting. I tend to listen to the, you and I never finished the sentence, for example, about why neither one of us was impressed by the report we got from that woman that was in the Berkeley Guardian. It was a long article about her experiences.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Now, I never asked you why you were not impressed. I know why I wasn't impressed, and I suspect it was the same. She didn't validate, they were all opinions.
Exactly.
There was no basis on which you could trust any of those opinions.
That's right.
Well, I think being a lawyer meant that I didn't read anything, even the things I fervently believed in, I don't read that way anymore. How do you know?
Is that same process had any negative effect? I'm just thinking of for myself. I know sometimes I listen, even in private life, I listen for the flaws in the logic.
That's right. I think it does. I think it does. In the same way that I think for a priest who's also a scientist, it must be a loss when he looks at a Madonna with tears rolling down and says to himself, "Oh, condensation." Everybody else is on his knees.
Right.
You know?
That's exactly right.
But I think that the same thing has happened to me. Yeah. It's also a function of getting old and experience, but I think it's probably mostly a function of the law. You and I had a similar experience just recently with your friend.
The young woman from Boston.
That's right. We were both very sympathetic, and all the time your mind was working and my mind was working, wondering what had she failed to tell a lawyer, what had she told the lawyer that she didn't remember or won't admit saying.
What wasn't she telling us about the story?
Right. What was she leaving out? And even what kinds of property did she try to hold on to? So that even when you like somebody very much, you tend to ask questions that you won't ask somebody who is with whom you're intimate. You won't ask those questions. You'll ask it in a lawyer-client relationship, but you wouldn't do it.
If you had it to do over again, would you go to law school? Or at the time that you did?
I don't regret it today at all, and I see in it things I was unaware of at the time. There must have been some need to dance for my father, in that sense. And I've gotten a lot out of it, but it was very hard because I carried on my back a terrible burden. Everybody who was my generation or a little younger had their hopes for themselves fixed on my succeeding. So that people of my generation who were dazzled by the fact that at 59 I started to study for a new career that I would only begin when I would be 62 or 3. They were dazzled by it and they admired it, but I was a symbol of the fact that they could still do something. They could go back to school, or they could start a new profession, they could get out of a marriage, whatever. And their hopes, they placed that burden on me so that I was more frightened of not making good because of the hopes that rested in me. Not too different, I think, from a young black who might be the first student admitted into a white school, having to make good and having to have good marks on graduation and not be put down for not being able to make it.
Florence is symbol as opposed to just Florence.
That's right. That's right. And I had the feeling very often during that time, I can remember very sad times when I thought, nobody sees my face. Nobody sees my face.
I would suspect, though, that the part of you that you talked about, the scar that, for whatever reasons wanted to have a college degree, there's some part of that must be healed over by the whatever we want to call it. You are a lawyer.
Do you want me to tell you the truth?
Yeah.
I have, from the time I left the board to this very day, and continuing, been playing with the notion of going back to school and getting my BA. I don't know if I can tolerate the callousness of very bright people. I sat in on a couple of St. Johnny classes, and I very much admire the St. John's College. And they were the brightest students you could imagine. But there's something they're so young, And it was like those first law tests. Would I go through demonstrating how I arrived at 12 times 12? Or would I say 144? So I don't know that I would be able to sit through classes like that. I now know that there are classes for seniors, and I might try doing that. I still want to get a degree. I won't do it, but I still yearn to do it.
Even with a law degree and all the other accolades and whatnot.
I don't know about accolades, but
how did the job?
I still feel that scattered kind of education. I never had the experiences of the great writers talking to each other. studying a period of literature where you saw how people touched each other and learned from each other and molded each other. I never, I've gotten all my books as single experiences. And neither do I put the literature, which was my fondest subject, together with history, which is my next fondest subject, or maybe even first. It doesn't have that kind of order and logic. And
But do you think that it would have had you gone to college?
I assume as much. I don't know. I don't know. It depends on whether I would have gone to a school where I would have gotten a good liberal arts education.
Right.
See, I came to revere that by, there was Hutchins and there was Scott Buchanan. I mean, the whole idea of St. John's College sprang from his forehead like Athena from the forehead of Zeus, It was a concept rooted in old educational patterns, but and Bill Gorman, who was a philosopher and a brilliant man. I mean, I worked for 10 years among people who had really very good, rich liberal art education. My husband had one too, and I never had that experience.
He had gone to whatever was called university there.
He went to the gymnasium where he had the equivalent of university education, and then he went to the University of Vienna. He made a very funny crack, by the way, when he was appeared before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, where he went to school, and he told about how he started to study medicine on a scholarship from the Viennese government. And he said, but in 1919, my sponsor collapsed.
Yes.
He did start.
Does a tape exist of his appearance?
No.
Do you know?
No, there's a transcript that exists.
There
but,
is.
Yeah, not very accurate, but.
But there was no such thing as a tape at the time made of it. Wouldn't that
no,
be wonderful if there were?
They